Okay, so what happens is in 1987, the Angolan military receives over close to what I estimate to be going through different records, some of this really Soviet records, about $1 billion worth of Soviet military equipment, right? They are prepared to launch a major offensive, right, to wipe out UNITA, and they're making these plans. The Cubans say, no, we don't believe this is really a correct plan to follow, because you can defeat UNITA, but what would you do if the South Africans intervene, given the previous history? It could be disastrous. The Angolans follow the Soviet advice. The Cubans wash their hands of the matter and they say goodbye, right? Okay, we think this is going to be disastrous, right? The Angolans launched this offensive called Operation October Salute. That's the translation of the Portuguese October Salute, because 87. This was in August of 87. That was going to be the 70th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. So they lost October Salute. They're on the verge of crushing UNITA. And it's launched from, the assault is launched with some of their best formations, right? And it's launched from Cuito-Cuanavale as a staging area. So they launched this offensive, right? And when this offensive is launched in southern Angola, okay, UNITA is about to be crushed. And the South African racist regime, the government is now faced with this problem. Their whole strategy in southern Angola is based on UNITA. If UNITA is destroyed, what are they going to do? And so they make the decision, and it comes out in the parliamentary debates. It comes out in the various declassified documents, and it came out with the interviews I made with South African generals. They intervene primarily to save UNITA, right? And then what happens is when they intervene to save UNITA, they inflict such horrible damage on the Angolan forces, right? Thousands are killed. And that they suddenly realized that while they had only intervened to save UNITA from the South African, from the Angolan military's forces, UNITA was on the verge of massive defeat, that suddenly they had inflicted such horrible losses, right, on the Angolan forces, that an opportunity had suddenly fallen into their laps. And the goal was, now, if we destroy all these forces, right, okay, all these forces, this would be an existential crisis for the Angolan government, and it might collapse, and therefore we'll achieve our long-term goal of complete control of Angola. And so what happens is, as they intervene, the Angolan forces begin to retreat, and as they retreat, they're retreating back to the staging area, which is Cuito-Cuanavale, and they're retreating back to Cuito-Cuanavale, and the South Africans try to cut them off, right? And there's a debate that emerges that way, that the South Africans say, well, the only reason we couldn't have cut them off was because our officers were incompetent, because obviously the Angolans, aren't, worthy enough to have actually, had an orderly retreat despite the losses that happened. So what happens is, I could go in for length on this, the South Africans, this was a bunch of officers, but then they come to the conclusion that we're going to take Cuito-Cuanavale, right? Now, what's interesting is they could have taken Cuito-Cuanavale, as Fidel Castro has pointed out, very easily, but that might have involved a significant amount of white casualties, okay? And they were very sensitive to that, because these wars were becoming increasingly unpopular, okay, in South Africa among them. One of the things that's important is that, and I would recommend, if you want to see one of the best anti-war films, there's one made called The Stick in South Africa that talks about how people are becoming increasingly disillusioned, right? Okay, so the South Africans settle on it. We are going to capture Cuito-Cuanavale, and we're going to destroy the best of these Angolan forces here, and then the road might be open to Luanda, and no way the Angolan government will be able to recover from this, and the Angolan government will collapse, right? And so they set on capturing Cuito-Cuanavale. At this moment, okay, as this is unfolding, right, the Angolans are facing a desperate situation, right? And so they make a request to Cuba, can you help us, right? Okay, it's a desperate plea. Can you help us? We're facing this existential crisis. Can you help us? And so the Cubans get together on November 15th of 1987. They meet at the Politburo meeting. They go through the night, and they decide that they're going to do two things. They're going to deploy enough forces to Angola to preserve Angola's independence, but they make a decision. We want to deploy enough forces, both in terms of quantity and quality, to once and for all settle this question of South Africa's aggression against Angola. And so eventually over 50,000 Cuban troops are dispatched, their best aircraft. In fact, they strip the Havana of its anti-aircraft defenses and send them to Angola. In fact, at one point, Fidel Castro says, we put the very existence of the Cuban Revolution at risk. And I think he means it in two ways. One, that basically speaking, if the United States had chosen to attack, and don't forget, this is in the midst of the Reagan administration, they'd invaded Grenada in 83, they had mined the harbors of Nicaragua and so forth, and so they were determined. So if the United States had attacked, Cuba would have stripped itself of its best military forces, even though Cuba had developed what we call a doctrine of a war of all the people, right? But also, if the Cubans had suffered a very significant defeat in Angola, it would have had significant repercussions inside Cuba itself, right? And one has to bear in mind, this is all before we begin to see the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, right? So what happens is the Cubans sent all of the planes and so forth into Angola. And in fact, when Fidel Castro goes for the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, there's a meeting with Gorbachev, and then some of the declassified documents, he actually says, he says to the Russians, you fucked things up. He actually says that, right? And now we have to solve this matter, right? So what the Cubans do is they adopt a strategy, and Fidel Castro, in a meeting in the non-aligned foreign ministers, right, in the summer of 1988, I think it may have been in June or July of 1988, he talks about what Quito Carnival was, right? He says, he uses a boxing analogy. Cubans were focused on defending Quito Carnival, okay? That's the job, okay? But the goal was, we're just going to hold them in Quito Carnival. So one important point is this is a very controversial topic, quote unquote, sometimes in South African Western sources. They say we were never defeated in South Africa. Because no, how could these Cubans, right, these mixed race and these African, these black people defeat us? Quito Carnival, at best for them, was a stalemate, right? Okay. But what they don't talk about is that was the goal of the Cubans, to hold them into a stalemate at Quito Carnival while they actually sent troops to the west, okay, to outmaneuver them. And there's something like close to 50,000 troops, 30,000 Angolan troops, another 6,000 SWAPO troops from Namibia outflank the South Africans. So while they're focused on Quito Carnival, they're completely taken unawares by this military maneuver to the west of them, and they get placed in a surrounded, almost encircled, and placed in a very, shall we say, a precarious situation, forcing them to withdraw, right? And when they withdraw, it alters the balance of power in the region, right? It does a number of things. It exacerbates the economic problems that South Africans are facing. One of the things I do put in my book is look at the economic situation, the impact of sanctions, the impact of the cost of waging the war, right? And so forth. And it also galvanizes Black South Africans, right? Because when the South Africans are forced to retreat from Angola, and there's two other battles that take place where the South Africans are defeated, right? Later on, it galvanizes Black South Africans, where they would talk about it. In fact, there's a famous speech by the Reverend, one of the famous Reverends, Cikiah from America, who talks about, like, labors all the problems that were inside, the violence that was happening, right? The massive repression inside South Africa and so forth. And he says, and then there was Quito Carnival, right? The South Africans used to actually, I interviewed people, smuggle a tape. The Cubans produced a documentary called La Puesta a la Escalada de South Africa, the response to the South African escalation. And they produced this huge documentary, right? And it was smuggled in South Africa and watched and so forth. So it has a tremendous impact. And it also has a significant demoralizing impact on white South Africans, right? But what it does is this military defeat, okay, contributes to the displacing of the military from power and Botha from power, right? So one of the central issues as a historian is, quite often historians, and I know I'm going very long at here, but I'm so obsessed with this subject, right? But what's interesting, not obsessed, so focused. What's interesting is that historians often say that the apartheid state was untenable, right? Because demographically, economically, and so on. And apartheid's collapse was inevitable, right? Okay, so everything is inevitable when you look in hindsight, right? Okay, but for me, the central aspect is this. Why does apartheid collapse at that particular moment, right? And P.W. Botha was extremely intransigent. He did not want to accede to Namibian independence. He was forced to accede to Namibian independence, right? Okay, because he didn't want SWAPO to come to power, which was the liberation movement in Namibia. He was forced to do that, right? And so what contributes to the Botha regime and the military getting displaced from power is this military defeat. Because when you militarize a state, it makes it that much more vulnerable to a setback on the military front, right? And so what happens is that it marginalizes Botha, and you can go through all the circle around it gets marginalized. That opens the way for somebody like de Klerk, a reformer, who then comes to power, okay, and attempts to orchestrate the collapse of the dissolution of apartheid in a way that benefits, right? Okay, the entrenched economic forces. That's a different story we can talk about, right? Okay, but Botha was entrenched. He did not want the apartheid regime to end. He was in transit, and we have to explain why he and the military get displaced. And they get displaced, I argue, I think, and others, because of the military defeat. It's important to also understand that significant sections of the South African capitalist class wanted apartheid to end, okay? Botha didn't, because Botha, I think, saw that Afrikaners would lose out to British capital, or to those who were of British descent, who were significant players in the capitalist class, right? So this whole discussion, I think, is that Kwito Kwanabala plays a central role. And when Mandela says so often, and when he says in that speech in Cuba, and I have a picture behind me of Mandela from July 26, 1991. He says in that speech, it's because of Kwito Kwanabala that I am free, right? And if you read the liberation movements literature, the ANC, the SACP, and other liberation movement literature, they all say it is Kwito Kwanabala that fundamentally, in the constellation of South Africa's economic problems, in the constellation of the struggle going on inside South Africa and so on, that really is a critical component at a particular time that really accelerates the end of apartheid itself. And I think that's where Kwito Kwanabala plays that central important role, right? One last point I'd like to make as well is that when Cuba actually sent its troops in 1975, and it's important to understand this, Cuba did it without consulting the Soviet Union, okay? In fact, it didn't tell the Soviet Union for over 2 weeks in 1975. And so there was this myth that Cuba was a puppet, right? A surrogate of the Soviet Union, acting, as a marionette controlled by them, right? There's a report in 1976 in the New York Times where it says the US State Department knows that Cuba acted for its own reasons, its own ideological reasons, right? But the United States prefers to keep the narrative up that Cuba is a puppet because it serves their foreign policy interests. You can read, for example, the US, in the Reagan administrations, the US's chief diplomat was a guy called Chester Crocker, right? Mm-hmm. And he writes memoirs, right? And Chester Crocker himself acknowledges that. Everybody acknowledges Cuba intervened or sent its military mission based on, one, its own ideological reasons, but more importantly, it was an independent decision. And Pero Iglesias' book clearly confirms that. And it's interesting that The Economist magazine, that cannot be said to be a supporter of socialism and much less the Cuban Revolution, has acknowledged that Cuba settled the issue and so forth. That Iglesias' book settled the issue of why Cuba intervened, whether it was a puppet of the Soviet Union. The other point to be made as well is the United States was so enraged, and Kissinger was so enraged, and I have the classified documents. His point was, how could they do this? Cuba must be punished for this, right? Because his idea was, and he had told somebody back in '68, I think it was one of the Chilean foreign minister, that the axis of history runs from Washington to London to Moscow to Tokyo, right? And in a sense that countries of the global south have no role to play in making history. And so he was very, very angry. And he had the US military drew up various plans, detailed plans, which I've read, right? Involving everything from a naval blockade to airstrikes to a whole series of other military actions, right? So in a sense, what Cuba also represents is the fact of, one, the independence of a country that is primarily, non-European, a country of the global south, exercising its agency, right? And so forth. And it's also, and I've often argued, the example of a very important part of the African diaspora coming to the liberation of Africa. And many, and if you go and you read through why Cuba talks about justifying this, right? From the leadership, from Fidel Castro all the way down to ordinary soldiers, they talk about the debt that humanity owes to Africa, the debt that Cuba owes to Africa, and so forth. And Fidel Castro becomes the first person in Latin America to define his country as Latin Africa, right? A Latin African country, to valorize, right? Okay, the African component. And I make an argument that this sets in place, over a long process of time, where Cuba has gone through a very interesting, very intricate, sometimes painful discussion about the role of race in its history, right? But this intervention in Africa, right, was very much part and parcel of valorizing Africans, okay, in world history, but also the humanity of Africans. And I'll stop there because, I could go on and talk about the medical internationalist missions that Cuba's launched since then, right? But Kwito Kwanabala is a central chronological marker in the demise of the apartheid regime.